The relentless sun beat down on the Arizona Territory in 1888, baking the earth and reflecting off the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch. For Elias Vance, the heat was just another oppressive layer to his already suffocating existence. He clutched a crumpled deed, the legal proof that his life's dream, the Lucky Nugget Saloon, was now just a ticking clock. Silas Blackwood, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of fear and contempt throughout the territory, had called in Elias's gambling debts. Blackwood wasn't just a businessman. He was a vulture, circling those weakened by misfortune, waiting to pick them clean. The 2-week deadline loomed like a thundercloud, promising a storm that would strip Elias of everything he held dear. He had poured his sweat and meager savings into that saloon, hoping to build a respectable life after a youth spent on the fringes. Now, that dream was dissolving like sand through his fingers. Elias had tried everything to raise the money. He'd ridden out to old mining claims, hoping for a forgotten vein of gold. He'd worked extra shifts, his calloused hands moving with a desperate urgency, but the meager earnings barely covered his daily bread. The whispers of the town, usually about cattle rustlers or poker games, now seemed to carry the judgment of his impending failure. He'd always prided himself on his self-reliance, but this time the problem felt too vast, too insurmountable. Each day that passed chipped away at his spirit, leaving him hollowed out, staring at the bottom of an empty glass in his own saloon, surrounded by the very sounds of revelry that once brought him joy. The air in the Lucky Nugget, usually thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and cigar smoke, now felt heavy with his unspoken despair. Every clink of glasses, every burst of laughter from the poker tables seemed to mock his silent agony. He watched his patrons, their faces flushed with drink and careless joy, and a bitter envy pricked at him. They had no idea the precarious ledge he was teetering on, how close he was to losing it all. The saloon, once a symbol of his independence, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, ready to collapse under the weight of Blackwood's demands. Elias was a man cornered, and the only escape he saw was surrendering to the inevitable, a thought that gnawed at his very soul. His gaze drifted to the framed photograph behind the bar, a faded image of his parents, their smiles gentle, their eyes filled with pride. He remembered their hopes for him, the quiet lessons about integrity and perseverance, the thought of them seeing him lose everything, of failing so spectacularly, was a deeper cut than any financial ruin. He felt the phantom weight of their expectations, a burden that made his shoulders slump even further. He had always believed in fighting to the last breath, but the sheer, brutal reality of Blackwood's power, combined with his own dwindling resources, left him feeling utterly defeated. The Arizona sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, but for Elias, the coming night promised only darkness. The following market day was a chaotic symphony of sights and sounds, a vibrant hub of life that starkly contrasted with Elias's internal turmoil. Wagons rumbled, peddlers hawked their wares, and the chatter of townsfolk filled the dusty air. Elias, however, moved through it all in a haze, his mind still fixated on his impending ruin. He'd tried one last desperate attempt to sell off some old, rusted mining equipment, but the offers were so insultingly low, they barely warranted a response. He felt a deep, gnawing emptiness in his gut, a mix of hunger and dread, as he resigned himself to the fact that he was truly out of options. His path, it seemed, was set, leading directly to the loss of his livelihood and his last shred of dignity. Then, a sudden shift in the crowd's murmur caught his attention. A small, somber procession slowly made its way down the street, drawing hushed whispers and pitying glances. It was a sight that stopped Elias cold. A tired mule pulling a rickety wagon, its sparse contents hinting at a hasty departure. Walking alongside, his shoulders slumped in defeat, was Thomas "Tomcat" O'Malley, a man known more for his bad luck at the poker table than for any sense of responsibility. But it was the small figure clinging to Tomcat's hand that truly pierced Elias's heart. A girl, no older than 12, her frame slight and her movements hesitant. Her eyes, wide and luminous in her pale face, held a raw, primal fear, a wisdom born of hardship that no child should ever possess. Elias instinctively moved closer, drawn by an invisible thread of concern. He heard fragmented words from the onlookers, whispers that chilled him to the bone. "Gambling debts," one woman murmured, her voice laced with sorrow. "Blackwood," another man added, his tone bitter. "Sold her to clear his name, they say, to him." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Selling a child to settle debts was a dark stain on the territory's rugged fabric, a practice born of desperation and cruelty. It was a transaction that stripped away not just property, but a human soul, reducing it to a mere commodity. The girl's name, he soon learned, was Lily, and the injustice of her situation burned within him with a righteous fury. In Lily's terrified gaze, Elias saw a reflection of his own powerlessness, amplified 100-fold. His problems were about property, about a business. Hers were about her very existence, her freedom, her future. The weight of her small hand in Tomcat's, the quiet despair etched on her young face, spoke volumes. This wasn't merely another consequence of Blackwood's greed. This was a fundamental violation, a betrayal of innocence. In that moment, surrounded by the indifferent bustle of the market, a profound shift occurred within Elias. His own despair, while still present, was eclipsed by an overwhelming need to act, to intervene, to save this child from a fate she did not deserve. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not stand by and do nothing. The stale air of the Grizzly Bear saloon, thick with the scent of stale beer and desperation, felt like a magnet drawing Elias in. He found Tomcat O'Malley hunched over a grimy table, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey his only companion. Tomcat, usually a boisterous figure despite his perpetual bad luck, was a shadow of his former self. His face was blotchy, his eyes red-rimmed and distant, reflecting a profound inner torment that Elias recognized as a kindred spirit to his own. The man was drowning in a sea of guilt and self-loathing, a stark testament to the ruinous path his gambling addiction had paved. Elias slid into the chair opposite him, the creak of the wood echoing in the relative quiet of the late afternoon. "Tomcat," Elias began, his voice low, almost a whisper against the clinking of glasses from the bar. "I heard about Lily, about Blackwood." Tomcat flinched as if struck, his hand trembling as he reached for his glass, sloshing whiskey onto the table. "Don't you dare judge me, Vance," he rasped, his voice raw with a mix of shame and anger. "You don't know what it's like. He threatened to burn my farm to the ground, take everything I ever owned. Lily, she's a smart girl. Blackwood promised her a good home, a proper education, said she'd be better off." The last words were a desperate, transparent lie, a thin veil over the agonizing truth that tore at Tomcat's soul. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the distant sounds of the town. Elias held Tomcat's gaze, seeing not a villain, but a broken man trapped by his vices and Blackwood's ruthless grip. "He won't give her a good home, Tomcat," Elias stated, his voice firm but laced with a quiet empathy. "He'll work her, treat her like chattel. You know how he operates. Lily deserves more than that." He paused, letting the truth sink in before leaning forward, a desperate, reckless idea taking root in his mind. "How much did you owe him?" The exact figure. Tomcat mumbled a sum, a staggering amount that would have been insurmountable for Elias just hours before. But now, fueled by the image of Lily's terrified eyes, the impossible seemed almost within reach. "I'll pay it," Elias declared, the words surprising even himself, yet feeling undeniably right. "I'll pay your debt to Blackwood, but in return, you have to sign a sworn affidavit stating the truth of the transaction, that you were coerced, that Lily was sold under duress, under threat of ruin, every detail." Tomcat's bloodshot eyes slowly focused, a flicker of bewildered hope, fragile yet real, appearing in their depths. "You'd do that, Vance, for a wretch like me," he whispered, disbelief coloring his tone. "For Lily," Elias corrected, his voice resonating with conviction, "and because it's the only decent thing to do." The bargain was struck, an unlikely alliance forged in the dim light of the saloon, a fragile promise against Blackwood's tyranny. Elias had no idea where the money would come from, but he had bought Lily a sliver of time, a chance at freedom. With the desperate bargain struck, Elias knew he couldn't face Blackwood alone. The man was a snake, slippery and dangerous, and any attempt to confront him single-handedly would be met with scorn, then retribution. Elias needed leverage, a force to counter Blackwood's ruthlessness, and his mind immediately turned to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was more than just the proprietor of the general store. She was the quiet backbone of Redemption Gulch, a woman of sharp intellect and unyielding principles. Her eyes, though often softened by a gentle smile for her customers, held a steeliness that few dared to challenge. She had seen the raw edges of life in the territory and understood the nuanced dance between law and the brutal realities of survival. He found her meticulously arranging bolts of fabric in her store, the scent of dried herbs and new leather filling the air. Sarah listened patiently as Elias laid out the situation, his own crushing debt, Tomcat's forced hand, and Blackwood's chilling acquisition of Lily. Her expression remained unreadable, but a faint tightening around her eyes betrayed her inner thoughts. When he finished, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the floorboards. "You're a fool, Elias," Sarah finally said, her voice low, but a flicker of admiration, almost imperceptible, danced in her gaze. "Blackwood plays dirty. He'll make your life a living hell." Elias met her gaze directly. "I know, but Lily deserves better than that, and I need help proving Tomcat was coerced. His affidavit alone won't be enough." Sarah walked over to her worn oak counter, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the dusty window. She was known for her quiet wisdom, her ability to see angles others missed. "Tomcat's affidavit is a start, but Blackwood will dismiss it as the ramblings of a desperate gambler," she mused. "We need something more, something Blackwood values more than his reputation, more than the sale of one little girl." A thoughtful frown creased her brow, then her eyes, usually so calm, suddenly glinted with an idea. "His land deeds. I've heard rumors, whispers from the farmers and homesteaders out on the plains. Blackwood has been pressuring folks into selling their land for far less than it's worth, using false claims, forged documents, and outright threats. If we can prove that, show a pattern of his deceitful dealings, we might have something that even Sheriff Brody can't ignore." And so, their unlikely alliance was forged. They began their meticulous work, a quiet, determined hunt for truth in the dusty corners of Redemption Gulch. Elias, with his understanding of the town's darker underbelly and his connections with the out-of-luck miners and gamblers, sought out those who had been wronged by Blackwood. Sarah, with her network of contacts among the women and families who frequented her store, used her keen eye for detail and her persuasive calm to gather stories, dates, and names. Each new piece of evidence, each hushed testimony from a frightened farmer or a dispossessed homesteader added another brick to the foundation of their case. The quiet determination in the general store, illuminated by the flickering lamplight in the evenings, became a beacon of hope against the pervasive shadow of Blackwood's power. The clock was ticking, but they were building a formidable defense, not just for Lily, but for every soul Blackwood had exploited in his relentless pursuit of wealth. The day of reckoning arrived, hot and still, the air thick with anticipation. Redemption. Gulch felt unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Elias, his nerves taut but his resolve unyielding, walked into Sheriff Brody's office. He carried a worn satchel, inside which rested Tomcat's affidavit and a growing stack of carefully gathered testimonies, sworn statements from farmers and homesteaders, their voices echoing the injustices they had suffered at Blackwood's hands. Beside Elias, Sarah Jenkins stood tall, her presence a silent, unwavering pillar of support. Her calm demeanor belied the fierce determination in her eyes, a testament to their shared conviction that justice, however elusive, was worth fighting for. Sheriff Brody, a man who usually preferred the path of least resistance and often looked the other way when powerful men like Blackwood were involved, shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, caught between his duty and the influential forces at play. Blackwood himself swaggered in, an arrogant smirk plastered on his face, believing this was merely a formality before Elias's utter defeat. "These are false accusations, Vance," he roared, his voice booming with feigned outrage, his face already purpling with a building fury. "You're just trying to wriggle out of your own debts, a desperate act from a desperate man." Elias met his gaze, his own eyes steady and unwavering, devoid of fear. "Am I?" he countered, his voice surprisingly calm, almost a murmur, yet it cut through Blackwood's bluster. He then began to lay out the evidence, piece by painstaking piece. He detailed Blackwood's systematic land grabs, the forged documents, the threats against families, the broken promises, and the quiet despair of those who had lost everything. Each document laid on the sheriff's desk was a hammer blow, chipping away at Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of respectability. The climax arrived with Tomcat's affidavit, shaky but truthful, detailing the coerced sale of Lily. The words, read aloud by Elias, painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a father trapped, forced to sacrifice his child to save his farm. The raw emotion in Tomcat's confession, corroborated by the mounting evidence of Blackwood's predatory practices, was the final devastating blow. Sheriff Brody, seeing the undeniable weight of the evidence and sensing the simmering discontent of the community, a potential uprising if he failed to act, made his decision. Blackwood, stripped of his power and exposed for the ruthless opportunist he truly was forced to relinquish his claim on Lily. A full investigation into his land dealings was launched, promising a long, drawn-out legal battle that he was unlikely to win. In the quiet aftermath, Lily, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning relief, was gently led to a tearful, repentant Tomcat. He might be a gambler, prone to mistakes, but in that moment, he was undeniably her father, and he promised, through his choked sobs, to do right by her, to never again let desperation blind him. Elias still had his own debts, a mountain of them, but a new kind of hope, a fragile but potent light, had ignited within him. The community, witnessing his unwavering stand against Blackwood, rallied around him. They offered odd jobs, helped fix up the Lucky Nugget, and brought in new business, a silent testament to their gratitude and newfound respect. Elias, with Sarah's continued quiet support and the unspoken gratitude of the entire town, began to rebuild his life, not just financially, but spiritually. He learned that grace wasn't just about being forgiven for one's mistakes. It was about finding the strength to fight for what was right, to extend a hand to those in dire need, and to discover, in the most unlikely of places, the true, profound meaning of redemption. The dusty winds of the Arizona Territory still blew, but now they carried whispers of justice, of community, and of the quiet, powerful grace found in the deepest human connections.